Good afternoon. I'm Ruth Stone, Associate Vice Provost for Research at IU Bloomington. And on behalf of the Vice Provost for Research, Sarita Soni, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2013 Distinguished Faculty Research Lecture. Since its earliest years, Indiana University has been dedicated to the mission of excellence in research and creative activity. During our institution's nearly 200 years of existence, our faculty have received countless recognitions, from Nobel Prizes to Guggenheim and MacArthur Fellowships to elections into prestigious academies such as the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Established in 1980, this lecture series was created to give our outstanding faculty another kind of recognition, a special platform from which to share their fascinating work with their own university community as we pay tribute to their accomplishments. Back in the 1960s, toward the end of his presidential career at Indiana University, IU's beloved Herman B. Wells speculated on what IU would be like 40 years hence in the year 2000. He concluded that the future of the university is limited only by our vision and by our courage to realize it. The people of Indiana in the year 2000 will have a better understanding of the true and unique character of the work of the university. They will comprehend that it holds the key to human progress and well-being. In the year 2013, the annual Distinguished Faculty Research Lecture Series continues to showcase the limitless vision of the faculty who work on the Bloomington campus. Their work is true and unique, to use Wells's words, offering keys to an enormous range of human questions. Over the decade, the series has offered our campus community glimpses into marvelous topics, ranging from abstract mathematics to Venetian art to the great books, journalism, history, evolution, and the nature of quarks. Today's Distinguished Faculty Research Lecturer is Susan Williams, whose work, as you will soon hear, is deeply involved with the promotion of democracy and equality around the world. In 1938, as World War II commenced, Herman Wells delivered an inaugural address in which he noted the university's role in preserving democracy. For the first time in several generations, he said, the trend toward democracy has been arrested. Never was the university's responsibility for the development of character of greater significance than at the present hour. I'm pleased to introduce this lecture series, which has long upheld the important role and real significance of our faculty's work. Susan Williams and her own important work will be introduced by her law school colleague and IU provost, Lauren Rebell. Please welcome Lauren Rebell.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you to the Office of the Vice Provost for Research for this wonderful award and the commitment that your office has to assuring the quality of the research mission on our campus on a daily basis. It is a real privilege for me to be here today. Normally, the Office for the Vice Provost gets to introduce the speaker, and we reversed the order today because I got to. It is my special privilege today to have the opportunity to say a few words of introduction for my colleague and my dear friend, Susan Williams. Susan is the Walter W. Foskett Professor of Law here at the law school. But in giving sort of an overview of Susan, I need to say that she is the complete academic. She is a deeply gifted and inspiring teacher. She is someone whose research has had enormous impact on the world, and she's a person of great personal integrity and courage. And I've had the opportunity to see that courage and integrity, often more courage than I had at the particular moment, in action now on 3 continents. So I want to take just a couple of minutes of appreciation for what I've seen over the years since Susan came to our law school faculty in 1993, I want to say. Is that right? 91, right. So Susan is a scholar of democracy at this point, and she brings to her scholarship a range of commitments that start with a deep understanding of feminist perspectives and an understanding of and commitment to the need for women's voices to inform structures of power and structures of governance. The early work that Susan did was around ideas of feminism, autonomy, and free speech and the First Amendment. Those commitments have grown to expand a very broad vision and understanding of ways in which constitutional design can accommodate women's voices and, more than accommodate them, empower them, and bring the perspectives of women into governance around the world. Constitutional design is you might think of it as a kind of technical exercise, but indeed it is the way in which we negotiate and express our normative commitments. And while we may not think, because we live in a country that doesn't tinker with our Constitution very much, that constitutional design is something that is of immediate impact. In fact, around the world at any given time, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of countries that are thinking about constitutional arrangements. Susan has been particularly important in focusing on areas of the world that are post-conflict areas, or sometimes not quite post-conflict areas, which leads to fun stories I can tell you during the reception afterwards. But it is at exactly those moments when when societies and countries are trying to think through who has access to mechanisms of power that constitutional design is most important for giving a voice. And that's where Susan's work has really found its fullest expression. And that's the place where her own personal commitment to assuring women's participation and voice around the world has been so evident. And Susan has put her time and her energy and her life on the line over and over again in country after country to bring women's voices to the table around constitutional negotiations. And I think that when we think about the kinds of impact a university can have, this is about as good as it gets. So with that small note of appreciation, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Susan Williams, for the Distinguished Faculty Lecture of 2013. I should note one last thing. I think this may be the only time in the history of the university, maybe, when the Distinguished Faculty Research Lecture has been given by both members of a couple at different points in their careers. So with that note, Susan, if I could.
Hello. I'm honored to have been asked to deliver this lecture today and to follow in a long line of colleagues whom I so deeply respect, including my husband. My thanks to Vice Provost Soni and Associate Vice Provost Stone. I want to thank Provost Robel for that much too generous introduction, but this is in fact only the latest of the very many gifts, large and small, that you have given me over 2 decades of friendship. So it is a great pleasure to be able to say thank you for them now. My thanks also to all of the colleagues here at IU who have made this such an intellectually stimulating and supportive environment, and to the students who have made it such a joy to teach here. Thank you to my dad for traveling to Indiana to share this day. And finally, and most importantly, thank you to my husband David and to my children Ben and Sarah, who are the heart of my life. So, because this award is based on scholarship, it led me to reflect on my own beliefs and assumptions about the nature of scholarship. So I hope you will excuse a few prefatory words about that subject. I believe that scholarship at its best should speak to the issues that are our deepest concerns and help us to better understand our deepest values. My particular approach to this goal, although I mostly fall short of it, of course, is to take a problem that is important to people, to dig through that problem, to try to find the ways in which it connects to the foundational structures and ideas that organize our lives, and then to offer some suggestions about how we might reconceive those structures and ideas so as to work towards a solution to the problem. This model of scholarship has 3 roots for me. First, it grows out of the nature of my discipline. And since I know this is a very interdisciplinary audience, let me say a few words about this. Lawyers operate under the generally salutary constraint of knowing that what they do makes a concrete difference to the lives of often identifiable people. Theory, in my view, is crucial to law, but theory is always at the service of practice, in the sense that it must ultimately offer some aid in addressing the real-life problems of actual persons. And as you will see in the analysis that follows, I will reject certain theoretical positions which, while appealing to me personally, have proven less than useful in the world. The second source for this model of scholarship is feminism. Despite the current unpopularity of the word, I am still inclined to call myself and my work feminist. As I understand it, feminism is a commitment to the equality of women and men, coupled with the understanding that, in fact, we are not there yet. And as such, it requires attention both to the causes and forms of inequality and also an effort to address them. So again, it's about making life better for people in a specific way. Finally, my model of scholarship has been deeply shaped most recently by my experience working with the Center for Constitutional Democracy here at the Maurer School of Law to help reformers in countries around the world develop constitutional mechanisms for building democratic institutions, practices, and cultures. In addition to the general advising work that we do, I have also worked with women's organizations and with women's rights activists in Burma, Liberia, South Sudan, and Libya on a range of constitutional issues related to gender equality. This work has been an amazing and humbling experience. Many of our partners in these countries have risked their lives, suffered imprisonment, and lived in exile for decades to try to bring democracy to their countries. The women activists have faced many of the same dangers as the men, with the additional burdens of sexual and family violence, lower economic and educational resources, greater family responsibilities, and the challenge of overcoming cultural expectations about women's role and place. They are among the bravest and most dedicated people I have ever met. And I very much want my scholarship to have direct relevance to the issues in their lives and the constitutions they're trying to shape. So, what I propose to do today is to address a very pressing problem in the lives of women and girls in many of the countries in which I work, the problem of gender inequality in customary systems of law. I'll begin by describing for you the status and operation of customary law systems and the ways in which such systems discriminate against women. I'll then briefly outline the approaches currently taken by various legal systems to try to bring customary law into compliance with the gender equality norms that are enshrined in most modern constitutions. Unfortunately, most of these approaches have had very limited success. So then I'm going to take a step back and introduce some ideas about the nature of culture, judgment, and justice in feminist theory. And finally, I will tie these strands together and suggest an approach to this problem that focuses on constitutional mechanisms for helping women within traditional communities to shape customary law to fit their own needs and ideals. The lesson I think I have learned from working on customary law is that real and lasting change in women's status is only possible when the women within traditional communities exercise power in their own customary systems. Or, to oversimplify, customary law will be consistent with gender equality only when women are judges in customary courts. And I want to suggest to you that this approach is part of a larger paradigm shift that organizes the legal reform of customary systems around the model of women as lawmakers rather than women as rights holders. So, let's begin with customary law. In many countries in Africa and Asia, there are systems of customary law that predate the formal state-based legal system and that continue to exist alongside it. I'm going to draw most of my examples today from Liberia, but this problem exists in somewhat varied forms in most of the other countries in which we work as well. Customary systems are sometimes blended with religious legal systems. We've been hearing a lot about Sharia law in recent years, and that is, in some places, a system that is a blend of both custom and religion. But customary law can also have its roots in tribal or ethnic cultures that are not understood predominantly in religious terms. And that, of course, is the case in Liberia. Such systems tend to have different rules from the formal legal system. They're enforcing tradition and custom, not the statutes passed by the legislature. Most customary systems focus on specific subjects, family-related issues such as marriage, divorce, and custody, and property-related issues, but they often include some rules regarding criminal behavior as well. And the important point here is the rules in such systems are not the same as the rules in the formal laws. For example, statutory law in Liberia requires monogamy, but customary law for many of the tribes includes polygamy. Customary systems also tend to have different procedures from the formal legal system. There are no lawyers. There are no rules of evidence. And the process often involves consultation with multiple constituencies in the community, family members, neighbors, elders, and so on. The judges in customary courts are not specialized officials. They are chiefs or elders who guide the community in other ways as well. And in some places, like Liberia, trial by ordeal is a traditional part of some customary procedure. Now, in countries like Liberia and South Sudan, systems of customary law are a crucial fact of life for several reasons. First, the governments in these countries do not currently have the capacity to provide a formal legal system that is accessible to people in remote areas. In both countries, once you leave the capital city, there are few courthouses, lawyers, or judges. In rural areas, people would need to travel substantial distances over poor or sometimes non-existent roads to reach a state-based court. And once they got there, the costs of litigating a claim, both official costs, such as court and attorney's fees, and unofficial costs, such as bribes, would make it impossible for many people to pursue a case. In short, the formal legal system is simply not available to many people as a mechanism for dealing with their disputes or even for handling many crimes. As a result, in Liberia, a recent study found that 89% of all disputes in several counties outside the capital city were taken to customary authorities, 89% as compared to 11% taken to the formal justice system. The numbers are actually even more dramatic in South Sudan. In short, whether outsiders like it or not, customary systems of law are a fact of life in these countries for the foreseeable future, because the formal justice system doesn't have the capacity to provide service to the majority of the population. In addition, many people in these communities prefer their customary systems to the formal system, and they will choose them even when the formal system is available. They prefer the customary system for two reasons. First, they believe that the formal system is controlled by people with money and influence, and they do not trust it to provide justice. In places like Liberia, where corruption is unfortunately endemic, this may be an accurate perception. And second, they prefer the customary system because it has a more restorative and less retributive orientation. The goal of most customary proceedings is to repair the social relations that were damaged by the crime or the dispute, rather than to punish the wrongdoer. As a result, these proceedings try to address the underlying issues that might have generated the problem, and they often involve families and community members in this resolution. Because of this orientation, many people believe that the customary system addresses their problems more effectively than the formal system. So, customary legal systems are both necessary and desired by the people in many places. In light of this fact, it shouldn't be surprising that customary legal systems are explicitly or implicitly recognized by the constitutions in many countries. Constitutions often specify that such systems may operate with respect to certain subjects, like personal status law, or they provide provisions recognizing the traditional authority figures in these systems, such as chiefs. In Liberia, for example, the Constitution recognizes customary law in at least two places, and also includes some protection for tradition more generally. So customary systems are a reality of life and a recognized part of law in many countries. But such systems are deeply problematic because they often violate human rights and other constitutional norms. In particular, most customary systems include gender discriminatory rules or procedures. For example, in Liberia, in many of the cultures, widows have no right to inherit their dead husband's property. It goes to his parents or brothers instead. Indeed, widows traditionally were seen as part of that property and were expected to marry one of their dead husband's brothers. Daughters have no traditional right to inherit their father's property. After divorce, women have no right to custody of their children. Early marriage is expected for girls in many groups, leading both to serious health issues and to a loss of educational opportunity. In some groups, spousal abuse is tolerated. In some groups, FGM, female genital mutilation, is practiced. Traditionally, women cannot be chiefs in most groups, which means, of course, among other things, that they can't serve as judges for customary disputes. And in some groups, it's considered unseemly for women to speak in mixed gatherings at all, so they would be discouraged from participating in the hearing in a customary case. In short, both in terms of the substantive rules and in terms of the process of decision, customary systems often discriminate against women. Now, the discriminatory nature of many customary systems raises a serious constitutional problem. Almost all modern constitutions include an equality guarantee that specifies that discrimination on the basis of sex or gender is prohibited. For example, Article 11 of the Liberian Constitution says that, quote, all persons, irrespective of sex, are entitled to the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual, are equal before the law, and are entitled to the equal protection of the law, unquote. If you have a constitution that includes an equality clause and that also includes clauses either explicitly or implicitly recognizing customary law, then there is a tension between these two clauses in your constitution that must somehow be resolved. And there are three possible approaches to this tension. First, it would be possible to say that the Constitution shouldn't recognize customary law. It should simply insist on a single legal system, which is subject to the equality guarantee. Some feminist theorists, such as Susan Muller-Oken, have advocated this approach. As I've suggested already, regardless of whether or not one thinks this is a theoretically attractive solution, it is simply not practical in many places. Second, and at the other end of the continuum here, one might recognize customary law and insulate it from the application of other constitutional norms, such as equality. In other words, the Constitution could recognize two completely separate legal systems: the state-based system, which is subject to the equality guarantee, and the customary system, which is not. Some political theorists of multiculturalism, such as Chandran Kukathas, have suggested this approach, and India has officially adopted it for the religious systems of personal status law that it recognizes. From a feminist perspective, however, such an approach is unacceptable because it represents an abandonment of the gender equality norms in precisely the areas of life of most crucial importance to women, such as family relations. Both of these strategies suffer from an additional problem as well. By casting the decision as an either-or choice between culture on the one hand and equality on the other hand, these approaches fail to recognize women's interests in being active members in and shapers of their cultures. Women are not merely the victims of culture. They act with agency, engaging with and reforming cultural policy. Constructing the problem as culture versus equality, where the legal system simply has to choose a side, casts women as the passive victims of culture rather than as its active creators. In so doing, it both falsifies the situation in which many women find themselves, a situation in which they feel committed to both their culture and their equality, and it obscures possibilities for resolving these tensions in more productive ways. So, the third possibility, then, is for the Constitution to recognize customary law, but try to move it toward consistency with the provisions of the Bill of Rights, including the equality guarantee. In other words, the Constitution might protect both customary law and gender equality rather than abandoning one of them, as the earlier options suggest. And there are several different constitutional mechanisms that different countries have tried to use to achieve this goal of bringing customary law into consistency with equality. First, some constitutions explicitly limit the protection for custom to those practices that are consistent with equality. In South Africa, for example, Article 31 of the Constitution protects the right of all persons to enjoy their culture, but specifies that this right, quote, may not be exercised in a manner inconsistent with any provision of the Bill of Rights, end quote, which of course includes an equality guarantee. Now, in theory, this is an excellent solution. And in fact, I want to endorse it as a practical matter as well. That is, I think it's a good idea for constitutions that recognize customary law, such as Liberia's, to include a clause like this. But in practice, this approach has proven to be less than effective. Clauses like this one are relatively rarely enforced. There is little enforcement, partly because women find it difficult to get to court to raise a constitutional challenge, and partly because even once they get there, the courts in countries where customary law is a meaningful fact of life are often reluctant to enforce such limits and interfere with custom. So the provisions, even where they exist, often go unenforced. But in some ways, there's a bigger problem than unenforcement. It's that even when people have made it to court, and the courts have been willing to enforce limits on customary law, that litigation has often led to an even worse situation for the women in traditional communities. When the government tries to intervene and force a traditional community to change its rules regarding women, the community often responds by becoming defensive, hardening its stance and putting pressure on the women involved to renounce their rights. Ayelet Shahar has called this response reactive culturalism. And the result is that women in these communities are seen as traitors to their cultures if they invoke the protection of the state against traditional practices. This social pressure makes life much harder for the women in these communities and essentially forecloses them from enforcing their rights in many cases. In short, where the state tries to force change on traditional communities in order to promote women's rights, the women inside those communities are often worse off. Thus, a constitutional provision designed to generate this kind of external pressure for change, while I believe it expresses an important public value, and while it may be necessary to have it so that you can use it in an extreme case, is not an effective way to make life better for women in these communities in general. So what else could we do? Well, another strategy tried in some places is to explicitly prohibit those specific cultural practices that are seen as most damaging to women. For example, the Constitution or a statute could prohibit FGM, or could prohibit polygamy, or could set a minimum age for marriage. There's actually been a global campaign to get governments to pass laws prohibiting FGM, so this issue provides a good test case for the effectiveness of this special prohibition strategy. I believe, once again, that such laws are important as a symbolic gesture, and they may be useful as a first step in changing attitudes and cultural expectations. But again, they do not seem to be sufficient to end practices like FGM. In some countries, the laws have been passed merely to satisfy an international audience, with no real commitment on the part of the government. Even where the law reflects the sincere belief of a governing elite, it is rarely the case that there is the enforcement capacity or the political will to apply the law to the literally millions of girls and women subject to this practice each year. The result is that in many of the countries where the practice is illegal, such as Kenya and Egypt, FGM continues to be the norm rather than the exception in many local communities. I want to again be clear, it is necessary to have laws like this. It is necessary to have laws prohibiting the most egregious form of human rights violations against women. But sadly, experience suggests that we should not expect those laws to actually prevent these practices in most cases. We have to be looking for other solutions. A third, more recent strategy that's been suggested is to create an enforceable right for women to participate in the formation of custom and culture. This, I think, is a very interesting development. Article 17 of the Protocol on the Rights of Women to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, for example, says, quote, "Women shall have the right to participate at all levels in the determination of cultural policies," end quote. And some countries, such as Namibia, have built such a right to participate in the formation of culture into their constitutions. Now, this provision, I believe, is an important step in a new direction. It seeks to give women not merely rights, but roles within cultural institutions that are oppressing them. As the attempt to impose equality rights or rights against FGM demonstrates, without the power to influence those institutions, rights will never be effective. It is because women lack such power and influence that they have been largely unable to use the rights their constitutions already give them. Thus, what women need in order to make their rights effective is the power to make and shape the norms that shape their lives. Now, this orientation, I believe, reflects a fundamental shift in paradigm, comparable to the shift that took place when women moved from being seen as property to being seen as rights holders themselves. The shift is, to borrow a phrase from Ruth Rubio Marin, to move from understanding women primarily as rights holders to understanding them as norm creators. exercising power within social institutions. Women cannot be merely the beneficiaries of the legal system. They must also be the makers and masters of that system. The difficulty with the particular mechanism in the protocol, however, is that it represents an incomplete paradigm shift. It recognizes the need for women to exercise power within cultural systems, but it structures the remedy for their current powerlessness as yet another right. And that structure guarantees that it will continue to be ineffective in exactly the same way as all the other rights discussed. In fact, I was in Liberia a few months ago discussing this issue with a large group of women's activists, and they were very skeptical about the ability of women to effectively demand such participation rights or of the legal system to enforce them. So I think this third strategy points toward the transformation that is necessary, but it does not sufficiently escape the old rights-based paradigm. Okay, now you have a sense of the problem facing constitutional drafters and reformers who want to deal with gender inequality in customary law. So let me bring in some feminist theory. The problem that we face is how to think more productively about promoting equality here. Why is it that rights are not enough? Why is a paradigm shift necessary? And how should we think about the new model of women's role so as to facilitate greater equality? And my suggestion is that feminist theory can help us to answer these questions. I will draw on feminist understandings of culture, of judgment, and of justice, and that will bring us back, in the end, to women as judges in customary law systems. Much of the theoretical argument over issues of gender inequality in customary law has taken place in the literature concerning multiculturalism in political theory. And feminists writing on this subject have criticized what they have identified as a billiard ball model of culture, which is at work in some of the arguments for cultural rights. The billiard ball model sees cultures as mutually exclusive, as having clear boundaries, right? You're in one or you're in the other, and having determinate contents. You can say in advance what the culture includes. So they are like billiard balls that simply bounce off each other. In opposition to this model, feminist theorists such as Sheila Ben-Habib and Ann Phillips offer a social constructivist account of culture, in which cultural communities have long interacted and shaped one another, and they have been internally heterogeneous and contested from the start. Sarah Song, for example, describes 4 elements of this constructivist model, and I'm quoting from her here. First, cultures are the products of specific and complex historical processes, not primordial entities. Second, cultures are internally contested, negotiated, and reimagined by members who are sometimes motivated by their interactions with outsiders. Third, cultures are not isolated, but rather overlapping and interactive. And fourth, cultures are loose-jointed. The loss or change of one strand does not necessarily bring down the entire culture. For our purposes, for thinking about gender equality in customary systems, the most important aspect of this model is the internally contested nature of cultures. We must pay attention to the power dynamics within a group and the way in which the cultural community's interaction with the legal system affects the status, power, and influence of subgroups within that community. In other words, certain forms of legal recognition for culture have a systematic effect of supporting traditional authority figures within communities and their views of the culture at the expense of the power and perspectives of more marginalized groups, including women. For example, when you reserve seats in the legislature for particular cultural groups, those seats are reliably occupied by traditional leaders. When you incorporate traditional cultural norms into state legal systems, think about blasphemy laws here, these tend to strengthen the traditional leaders, and the traditional leaders are overwhelmingly male. And it strengthens them as against more marginal or progressive elements in the community that may be contesting those cultural meanings. The important point is that there is no neutral position for the state here. Action and inaction by the legal system both have consequences for the distribution of power and status inside the cultural community. So the lesson of this feminist reassessment of culture is that the law cannot effectively promote women's equality in customary systems without actually paying attention to and engaging with the impact of legal rules and institutions on the internal power dynamics of these communities. Thinking about culture as fluid and contested also, I think, focuses our attention on the crucial role of judges. In customary systems, rules are not made through a legislative process. The rules are understood as already given through tradition. But that doesn't mean that the rules are static. They grow and change over time, and their interpretation and application is often contested within the community. The process through which this change and contestation takes place is the judicial process, the hearing of cases. So for the lawyers in the room, customary law is a common law system. Judges are the people with the power to create and recreate the norms in that system. Now, why does it matter whether those judges are women? One might claim that all the judge is doing is applying a rule that, after all, is already given by tradition. And that would lead us to an examination of what exactly judges are doing when they engage in this sort of common law method. Feminist writing on the concept of judgment suggests that we need to reform our understanding of this concept as well. As Jennifer Nedelsky has pointed out, judgment is not about simply finding a fact in an accurate manner, and it is not susceptible of that sort of certainty. Indeed, it is precisely in the areas of life where factual accuracy or certainty are not possible that we tend to speak about the exercise of judgment. Judgment is best understood in a relational way, as asking us to reflect on our own perceptions and experiences, to consider the perspectives of others, and to reach an understanding of the situation that responds to moral and sometimes social concerns as well as to empirical ones. In other words, the exercise of judgment is a creative process in which a judge is not merely declaring a fact that pre-exists her decision, but creating a social reality through the process of decision. It is this creative power that women need to exercise in order to make their rights a reality. Another way to see this is to think about Nancy Fraser's model of justice as parity of participation. Fraser suggests that real equality of participation includes three related but independent aspects. First, people must be recognized and respected. Second, people must control sufficient material resources to participate fully in social life. And third, people must have voice and representation in the institutions that affect them. Customary law systems generally fail to provide all three of these requirements to women. The customary law system involves injustices of failing to recognize and respect women, both in its procedures and in its substantive rules. While women can and do participate in the public hearings as parties, witnesses, and/or community members, they are expected to play a lesser role than men. Now, I want to quickly add here, I'm not saying that women in general are disrespected or denigrated in these cultures. There is significant respect afforded to women in their traditional roles as mothers, and in Liberia in their traditional roles as leaders of female secret societies, known as Sunday societies. But there is a very powerful separate spheres ideology that serves to marginalize them through cultural symbols in the area of customary legal proceedings. Similarly, the substance of the rules in customary systems often involves symbolic devaluation of women. There's an interesting argument over whether bride price should be understood as treating women as property, This is where a prospective husband pays money to the parents of the prospective wife or transfers property, whether that's treating women as property or whether that's recognizing the very significant value of a girl to her family. I've seen arguments on both sides. But in places like South Sudan, where a girl may be given in marriage to pay off the blood debt incurred by violence between families, there can be really very little argument over the fact that she is being treated as analogous to the cattle or money that will also be part of the debt repayment. Equally clearly, the rules allowing a husband to physically chastise a wife are based on a cultural image of women and of the relationship between men and women that denies women's equality. So, symbolically, in terms of recognition and respect, customary laws do not accord women parity of participation. Turning to material resources, the customary system involves a denial of parity to women in terms of resources and opportunities as well. This is clearest perhaps in the denial of inheritance rights to girls. Sons inherit but daughters don't, but it's prevalent throughout the system. Marital property is under the husband's control, children belong to the family of the husband in the case of divorce, and education is much less valued for girls. Indeed, these sorts of substantive rules that disadvantage women are the focus of efforts to reform customary law in Liberia and elsewhere. But here's the important point for our analysis. Even if these first two problems could be corrected, even if the law could force customary systems to give women respect and to redistribute material resources to them, those systems still would not be just if they did not also give women the voice and power to participate in the creation of the rules. This is the third dimension, the dimension of representation, and it is an independently necessary aspect of justice. If women don't participate in the creation of the rules and institutions that shape their lives, they can hardly be considered equal. So, feminist understandings of culture, of judgment, and of justice help us to see, I think, why we need a paradigm shift. Giving women rights, while it is important and necessary, will never be sufficient, because the rights operate within a cultural context in which women are disempowered. Only by giving women the power to change that culture from the inside, to be the norm creators in that cultural enterprise, can we assure that they are able to enjoy their rights. Now, this paradigm shift has consequences for constitutional design. It suggests that the focus of our legal reforms should not be on mapping out in advance the particular forms that cultural practices or institutions should take. In other words, we shouldn't be monopolized by saying, you may do this and you may not do that. Okay? Instead, we should be thinking, at least some of our thoughts should be directed to the question, how do we design incentives, opportunities, and resources that will allow the women inside these communities to play a more active and central role in creating their future cultures? So this new model seeks to give women not only rights, but the power to shape their own traditions. And, importantly, it seeks to give incentives to traditional leaders within these communities to include women in the process of norm creation. Now, the particular form that such opportunities or incentives should take will vary with the context. There is no constitutional solution that fits all sizes here. But I can provide a few examples from the Liberian context that will illustrate certain principles that I think can be adapted to different countries' circumstances. There are at least 4 mechanisms that might be useful in light of this new paradigm. The first 2 mechanisms have to do with opening up the customary law system to the possibility of change, just breaking it open, making it more flexible. The second 2 mechanisms have to do with increasing women's ability to be the agents of that change. So first, in order for women to be able to reshape customary law, that law has to be seen as the expression of a fluid, living culture that has the capacity to grow and change over time. And the Constitution can help to generate this understanding of customary law. by specifically describing custom and tradition in these terms. In other words, in the Liberian Constitution, as in many other constitutions, there are words protecting and promoting traditional culture. In those provisions, the Constitution can specify that what is being protected are not the rules as they exist at any particular moment, but rather the practice of custom and tradition by a community as it changes and grows over time. Now, the long-term general consequence of a provision drafted this way would be to help courts and policymakers approach customary law in a different way. Rather than attempting to insulate or preserve particular customs, they would be guided to strengthen the community's ability to develop, articulate, and adapt its own traditions. This shift in understanding wouldn't happen overnight, of course, but a provision like this can be one mechanism for encouraging the gradual development of this attitude. But there is a more immediate and specific consequence of a provision like this as well. And the immediate and specific consequence is that it would end the practice of codifying customary law. In Liberia, as in many other African countries, the national legislature has codified some customary law in statutes that are intended to be applied by both the regular courts and the customary legal system. This practice, I believe, should stop, and the existing statutes should generally be repealed. The practice of codification has the unfortunate effect of freezing customary law as of the moment it was memorialized. And generally it freezes it in the form approved by traditional leaders without any consideration of dissenting voices within the community. Customary systems should be encouraged to see themselves as living parts of the culture, adapting and growing in response to the changing needs and views of the community, and codification restricts this process. Now, let me quickly add here, the impetus behind codification is completely understandable. The goal of codification was to restrain the discretion of individual decision makers so that individual customary court judges would not do outrageous things. And it was to achieve more consistent application of the rules across cases. These are perfectly reasonable goals. But codification is a bad way to achieve them because of its effect of freezing custom. The goals could be better achieved through the methods of the common law, that is, the use of precedent, which could be facilitated by recording the judgments of customary courts and making such records widely available. This sort of information gathering and dissemination, which of course could be supported by the government, will benefit the customary system not only by providing some constraint on individual judges' discretion and some consistency of results, but also, most importantly, by providing a knowledge base about how communities handle similar issues. So, for example, if I can look at case records and determine that the next village over, which belongs to the same tribe as mine, interprets its customs so as to allow girls to inherit their father's property, then I might argue to the chiefs in my village that we could also make that shift. Providing this kind of knowledge without tying the system down through codification strikes an appropriate balance between consistency and flexibility. And the Constitution could contribute to this process by explicitly protecting custom as a living and changing system, and thereby ending codification. Okay, so that's one way to break the customary system open. The second thing is that the capacity of customary courts really needs to be increased and developed. When I was in Liberia, I was talking to an official from UNMIL, the UN mission in Liberia, and he was telling me that donors have given millions of dollars to Liberia to build the capacity of the formal court system, and no money has been spent to improve the capacity of the customary court system. The government, with the help of international donors, could offer a range of opportunities and resources to customary legal systems that would help open them to the possibility of change without coercing them to do specific things. So, for example, the government could offer support for the personnel to create and keep the records that I was just talking about. The government could also provide training to customary leaders on the Constitution and on international human rights, so that they have a better understanding of the legal order as a whole and the values that underlie it. And the government can provide information and education to customary judges on issues relating to gender equality. For example, by giving them the data that shows that increasing the status of women is one of the most effective mechanisms for increasing the wealth and welfare of the society as a whole. Now, the goal in this kind of capacity building is not to turn customary courts into just another state agency. Rather, the goal is to broaden the horizons of those who are exercising judgment in such courts. And perhaps one way to make such educational efforts more palatable and more productive would be to make them more reciprocal. That is, customary judges could also be asked to educate the members of the government who make policy on issues related to custom, and who, after all, need to understand the systems they're seeking to support. All right, so these are strategies for opening up the courts to the customary courts, to the possibility of change. Once they've been opened up, then the women inside the traditional communities need to be given the resources and opportunities to become effective participants in shaping their cultures. Again, there's no simple way to achieve this goal, but there are at least two interrelated strategies. The first strategy is just to give women resources to increase their capacities in general. Education, economic empowerment, microfinance, leadership training, and so on. One avenue which has been promoted with great energy and determination by the Association of Female Lawyers of Liberia is education for women about the legal rights and remedies available to them. In addition, the reconstruction of the educational system in Liberia is, I think, perhaps the single most important thing that could be done to increase the capacity of women. And this is a multifaceted problem. It relates to a whole series of issues concerning breaking down barriers to girls' education. And that includes things like eliminating school fees that create a disincentive for parents to send girls to school, ensuring girls' safety in and on the way to school. The risk of violence both in and on the way to school is a huge disincentive for their attendance, and public education concerning the value of educated girls to the community. So the first strategy here is just to increase women's capacities and resources. I think everyone concerned about gender equality, whatever their views on customary law, would agree on this part. The second strategy is harder. It is to create incentives for the traditional authorities in these communities to support women in accessing these resources and in increasing their participation in positions of influence over the customary systems. Now, this strategy is necessary because the government can offer as many resources as it wants, but women will not be able to take advantage of those resources, education, economic empowerment, and so on, unless their communities support them in that effort. And even once they have those resources, they won't be able to translate their increased capacity into increased influence over customary law unless they're given entry to positions of power in those systems. So one of the central questions posed by this paradigm shift is how can the law provide incentives for traditional authority figures to cooperate with and support these sorts of projects? Now, again, this is a question that could only be answered in a particular legal context. It's going to require some creativity. Indeed, I suspect it's going to require some trial and error to develop effective responses. But I can give you some examples of the kinds of programs we might think about to create such incentives. So imagine a scholarship program for young people from an underserved area of the country to attend the university. And imagine that as the percentage of girls participating in this program increases, the total amount of scholarship aid given to each student also increases. If the community wants its sons to get the most benefit from such a system, it will need to include its daughters as well. Or perhaps the government might offer greater recognition to a customary system of a particular group as the role of women in that system increases. So if a community makes women judges within its system, if it increases the participation of women in its hearings, then the range of cases it's allowed to handle through its customary system might be increased, or the level of respect for its judgments when they reach a state-based court might be increased. This linkage would help traditional leaders who want more scope for customary law to support the inclusion of women in positions of power in the system, or at least it would give them incentives to do so. My point here is not to endorse these particular programs, but to point us toward asking the right question. We have to think creatively about ways of getting traditional leaders to facilitate women's empowerment rather than acting as a barrier to it. Okay, let me use the Liberian example to make one final point. I understand that there is a great risk in turning to internal community evolution to deal with the problem of gender discrimination in customary law systems. The cultural evolution that this model hopes to encourage is a very slow process. And in the meantime, the women in these communities will be harmed by the persistent gender inequalities enforced by customary law. Even if there is some minimum protection that's afforded by the state legal system, so extreme forms of coercion won't be tolerated, there remains a wide scope for harm and discrimination by their communities. I do not in any way wish to minimize the costs that women will bear during the time it takes for them to gradually change their cultures. But based on my experience working in countries facing this challenge, I nonetheless believe that accepting these costs may be the best path to a future of greater equality. In the long run, the welfare of the women in traditional communities depends on their own ability to participate effectively in the shaping of their culture. The only way to avoid reactive culturalism and to make stable progress towards equality is for the community to move towards this future through mechanisms it experiences as voluntary. Now, let me rush to add, voluntary doesn't mean that the community is unaffected by interaction with and even pressure from outsiders and other cultures. That sort of isolation has never been the case for cultural change. Pressure is fine, but it does mean that the response to those pressures has to be experienced as generated through a process internal to the community, rather than one imposed from outside. Otherwise, even if a particular case can be resolved so as to help an individual woman, the cultural reaction generated by the imposed solution will mean that other women in the community will pay the cost. Their efforts at cultural challenge and growth will be set back. So in the long run, opening up the channels for internal change by women is a necessary part of reaching greater equality. It's not sufficient, to be sure, but equality cannot be achieved without it. So, we need a shift in paradigm. When we think about designing a constitution to help bring customary law into harmony with gender equality, we cannot simply be asking ourselves which rights the Constitution should give to women. Do they need a right to equality, and what exactly should it say? Do they need a right to education, or to freedom from domestic violence, or to physical security that would protect them from FGM? They need all of these things, but such rights will never be enough. We need to shift our attention to a new vision of women as the makers and masters of their customary systems. And our goal should be not merely to ensure that women are helped rather than hurt by these systems, but to ensure that they are part of the process of setting the norms and creating the rules in those systems. This shift in paradigm leads us to think about issues that weren't apparent when we were just trying to figure out which rights to give women. It asks us to consider, first, how the Constitution can make the customary system more fluid. Second, how it can help make women more effective and powerful within that system. And third, importantly, it requires us to consider how the Constitution can affect the incentives of those who currently exercise power in customary systems so as to make them allies in the process of empowering women, or at least reduce their desire to be roadblocks. The goal of a constitution, I want to suggest to you, should be much more than a customary system that is not discriminatory. It should be a customary system that women control equally with men. A customary system in which women are lawmakers. And I believe that this different way of approaching the issue offers hope of resolving some of these intractable problems. And that's why I'm suggesting that women must be judges in customary courts. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm open to questions. Yep, David.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, it's fascinating to see you drill down in terms of some of the issues related to women's rights in culture at a local level. But I have to say, as I was hearing you think through the potential solutions, there's another culture that's almost as big a problem, and that's the international level, where there is no tolerance for compromise, no patience, right, for the kinds of changes that you're suggesting, no resources unless you agree that it's absolute, and no patience.
Right.
And so I'm wondering how the problem that you've identified is difficult enough as it is, but the culture that exists at the international donor level, or even in the international human rights community, seems to me to be, if these two things have to come together, and I actually don't know which one would be more difficult.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And in fact, in a different paper, I used Nancy Fraser's analysis in a little more detail because her most recent book actually talks about this issue in a very interesting way. She is looking at what she calls spheres of justice, right? And so the national level is what we normally think about when we think about law. But she wants to also think about the international level, or even global. That is, doesn't have to be international institutions. It could be other sorts of supranational frameworks. And I use that by adding the local level, right, which she doesn't discuss, but which I think is actually crucial. I use that to look at South Sudan, including at the international level. And South Sudan's a wonderful example of exactly what you're talking about. Juba, when we were there a little over a year ago, really felt like a sort of boom town from the Old West. Huge amounts of building going on, and lots of people running everywhere, and dirt streets, and so it really sort of felt like an Old Western. But everything that's being built is being built by a foreign government or an international organization. Okay, the place is swarming with international aid workers and the representatives of governments establishing relations to this new country. And they all have the kind of agendas that you're talking about. So I agree completely. I think this is a paradigm shift that I would have to operate at all levels to be useful. And the one thing that gives me hope is that while you know the international organizations so much better than I do, sometimes there are individuals on the ground who actually understand the situation a little better. And sometimes they can be persuaded to support certain kinds of initiatives that might not be, completely in line with the objectives of the organization as a whole, and that might push in this other direction. Because I think you're right, as long as international bodies are essentially saying to countries like Liberia, sign on the dotted line, right? Agree to this, that, and the other thing, and then you're off the hook, right? That's what we want. We want your commitment to, a law against FGM. And they say, oh, sure, we'll sign that. And then that's it. It's going to be useless. So they do have to change their orientation as well. I agree. I would love to hear your thoughts about how to do that. Yes, Bill.
It was a fantastic lecture, Susan, so thank you. But at the end of the day, don't you want to redeem the unredeemable? Right? You point to all the problems with customary law for women, and then you say, let's reform customary law, but you want it to be something which goes against what many people want from customary law. They don't want it to be dynamic and a living law. I mean, that may be the reality of it, but the ideology, the mindset is that it's not that, like that it actually captures tradition and it's somehow, stable in a way that statutory law is not.
Right.
So it seems to me your reform really it's really not about an internal evolutionary reform of customary law. It's about turning customary law into something very different from what most people see customary law being. Now it still may be the right way to go.
You're right. I understand.
I think your proposals are actually much more radical in terms of undermining customary law than you want to let on.
Well, being called a radical never actually worries me all that much. But I want to resist a little bit. Okay. My sense, when we were in Liberia the last time, we had the most amazing experience. We went to talk to the Traditional Chiefs Council. Okay, and we met with the leader of the Traditional Chiefs Council, and we also met with his sort of deputies, one of whom was a man and one of whom was a woman. It was very interesting. And we had a long time talking to the deputies. We had a very short and very formal audience with the paramount chief. There's no question but that there are all sorts of things in the customary system that militate against this understanding. I agree with you. That's real. I don't want to try to deny that. I do want to say there are some things inside that are useful as well, though. And one of the most interesting things I found in talking to the folks in this office was that they really wanted to defend what they understood to be the inherent values of the customary system as a dispute resolution system, as against the more formal legal system. And the sort of the restorative justice picture, right, was extremely important to them. Now, I think that's usable, right? I think that's usable in a whole range of ways. First, it's just usable as an incentive. They want this, and so you can sort of pressure them to move in certain directions to get it. But it's also usable because the restorative justice model itself has a kind of non-rule-based, flexible, contextual approach that could be generalized to more of customary law. And I think if we can encourage them to continue to see it in those ways and to strengthen those aspects of the system, I see possibility. I think you're not accusing me so much of being radical as of being an idealist, and that's right. And so I really have to admit up front, I don't know how far it could go, right? You sort of have to try it and see. What I do know is the other things we've been trying have not been working very well. So my suggestion is we should try this for a while.
To which you referred, Susan, and forgive my ignorance in asking this question, has there been an increase in the number of women in the more formal courts? And in those countries where there's been some movement towards such an increase, has there been any visible impact on the customary system?
Oh, it's a wonderful question, and I have only limited information, so I will tell you what I know, but will also admit that I think I should learn more about this in some of these places. South Sudan is very, very new. Okay, so they are really still setting up their formal justice system. They are a new country, and the literacy rates in both South Sudan and Liberia are substantially lower for women than for men. and are not very high for anybody. Okay, so the pool of people from whom one might draw magistrates or judges for the formal court system is really pretty small. In Liberia in particular, it's a very small population, period, something between 3 and 4 million people. And given the illiteracy rates, people really disagree about what literacy means, right? So the numbers are very variable, but given the fact that substantial percentages, by many estimates, majorities of the people are illiterate. The number of people of either gender who are available to serve in these posts is really very limited. In Liberia, lots of magistrates had no legal training, the lowest level of the courts. So the lack of legal training wouldn't necessarily be dispositive. As you get a little higher, you must have legal training. There are very few women, right, with legal training. Growing numbers, but much smaller percentages than for men. So in South Sudan, I guess what I would say is I'd be surprised if there are hardly any women judges. In Liberia, there definitely are some women judges, but the pool of women who could be drawn on for that position is very limited indeed. So I don't think we have enough representation of women in the formal justice sector to know yet whether that would have a big impact. And I would certainly say this is not a move that I think should be limited to customary law, right? That is, I think this picture of seeing women as the owners of the systems, right, rather than the beneficiaries of them, I think this is crucial across the boards, right? This is what's behind legislative quotas. This is what's behind getting women into the judiciary, and it's important in all those contexts.
Your idea that women should be decision makers, I infer from Ron's question, is not based on seeing them as decision makers in a particular context. But is it based on seeing them in a context that suggests that the women in these sort of traditional systems can do this and want to do this? So can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, this, I'm going to come back then to the conversation with the lady in the tribal council office, which was really remarkable. She assured me that women now are allowed to be chiefs in many tribes in Liberia. And I've also had people tell me that doesn't mean they are. That is, there's some disagreement about how much change there's actually been. But what there has been is there's been a change in what will be said about it, right? Even if there has not yet been as much of a change on the ground. It was very funny because in the same conversation she said to me, oh, women can be chiefs now. And then she told me this wonderful story where there was this traditional chief who nobody actually really respected. And the truth is that in Liberia, chieftaincy is not this very simple inherited thing. I mean, if people don't respect you, you don't stay chief for very long. So why did he stay chief? He stayed chief because they respected his wife. And what used to happen is the chief would listen, and then he'd go back into the house, right? And he'd talk it over with his wife, and then he'd come out and he'd make his judgment. And everybody knew that the judgment was coming from the wife, but it was not acceptable for her to be the one making the judgment, right? So it's a system in transition. It's a system very much responding to the kinds of international pressures that David was talking about. And I don't think those pressures should let up, right? That's not the argument I'm making, right? Continuing to say we want to see change in these ways is a useful thing. It's a useful thing for the women inside these societies, right? They make use of that in their own struggles for power, in their own internal struggles for power. But what I'm suggesting is we should be thinking about more specific mechanisms for opening channels to power rather than simply creating entitlements. which just don't seem to work very well.
Susan,
Yeah, sorry.
an observation.
Yeah.
Liberia and South Sudan have a commonality.
I do.
It might be interesting to look at South Africa, which is a much more complex society. And customary law operates in a different context there. And certain of the issues we've raised might have been resolved in different ways. And there might be some suggestive ideas from that.
Absolutely.
That could be useful.
Thank you so much. Yes, South Africa is a leader in so many ways in constitutional design in Africa. All of the other countries look to South Africa. And one of the really interesting things about it is, and I know only sort of bits and pieces, but I'll give you one of those bits. There was a fascinating case in South Africa where it had to do with the chieftaincy of a particular group. And the traditional rule was that the chief had to be male. So the old chief dies, he has a daughter but no sons. So the chieftaincy passed, this was maybe 20 years ago, to his brother. Now the brother dies, and he has a son, but the people don't like the son. They don't want him to be chief. So they decide to change their rule and to say women can be chiefs and to go back to the daughter of the earlier chief. Well, the son sues in a South African court, saying this is a violation of my rights under customary law. Okay. And at the trial court level, the court agreed with him. They said, you're right, the custom is it's only men, and so you get the chieftaincy, she doesn't. But when it went higher on appeal, the higher courts in South Africa said, custom is a living, breathing thing. And if the group itself decides that they want to change it, and particularly if they're changing it in directions that bring it into consistency with constitutional values, then of course we're going to let them do that. And so I think this was a wonderful example of a court adopting this sort of approach in a very productive way. Yeah.
I'd like to invite,
Sorry.
one more question,
Sure.
okay? And then after that, we'll.
Okay.
I tend to be very pragmatic in thinking about things. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the other kinds of incremental ways that women can take on roles that are not becoming chieftains, but are doing something that gets closer to power, gets them more acceptable as actual decision makers. And so I think about, can they be fact finders instead of decision makers? You know, can they be? So what is some of the things along those ways that you can imagine? Because that's where you want to set the incentive structure, right?
Good. Yeah, absolutely. These are exactly the kinds of questions I think that are necessary. And what's so difficult about them is that even in a country as small as Liberia, there will be multiple answers for different groups, right? So this has to be done totally at the retail level, right? It cannot be done wholesale. It can't be done in general. But to give you an example, there are in some groups in Liberia positions, traditional positions for women that are not chieftaincy, but that are nonetheless positions of authority and influence. In some groups, there actually was a woman chief along with a man chief. In some groups, traditional spiritual roles, right, would have a husband and wife team, right, as the people who provided the spiritual services for the community. And in many, many places, women are elders. So they play the sort of semi-official role of wise people in the community that other people might go to for very unofficial dispute resolution, or even wise people that would be consulted by a chief trying to make a decision. So taking the resources you've got in each culture and trying to build on them to create incentives for women in those positions to be strengthened and for more women to be given positions like that I think that's an incredibly useful way of starting on the ground in the details, not in the more general way. I think that's crucial. People can only start where they are, and maybe this sort of responds in a way to Bill's comment earlier. People can only start where they are. And so if these cultures are important to people, as I believe they plainly are for a whole variety of reasons, then we have to start with them as they are and build from them towards something better, from the inside, rather than imagining that we're either going to wipe them out or we're going to remake them from above in our image. And that's the basic point. Thank you.
I know that Susan may be available to answer some more questions informally. We'd like to invite all of you up to the third floor faculty lounge for refreshments and a reception. And once more, I'd like to thank you, Susan, for very stimulating the talk.